Welcome to everybody who's at home on YouTube. Good morning, Nolan. Welcome back. I wasn't here last time, and I want to just recognize Sharon Bressler for chipping in and helping out and hosting and emceeing the program last time. We've got our program today with Rabbi Lebovitz, who's going to be talking to us about Back to the World of the Bible. And then another rabbi, Ari Averbach, who's going to be talking about synagogue. That's a play on words. The greatest Jewish moments in cinema. And then we have lunch, of course. And today we have a special Hazak Torah study session. It's the podcast taping of Torah on the Go with both Rabbi Feinstein and Rabbi Lebovitz in the Schulweis Chapel today. So it's not going to be in the Bernstein balcony. It'll be in the Schulweis Chapel. And if you have questions about Pesach, be prepared to ask them during the podcast. The rabbis are prepared to take some questions. And you can go to the podcast Torah study or Great Decisions. Again, will be in the discussion group will be in the youth lounge again today with Jerry at 12:45. Our next and actually last Hazak Monday program will be in 3 weeks because of Passover on May 6th. And we got a very interesting program on that day. Professor Vermaglich is going to be talking to us about too long, too foreign, too Jewish, anti-Semitism, and the name changing in New York City. So it's about Jewish name changing. Very interesting topic. And then we have Steve Cohen who's going to be talking about baseball and opera. Baseball season is opened, and believe it or not, I guess there's some baseball and opera. We also will have, of course, our Torah study and Great Decisions on May 6th. Hopefully all of you have now seen that on May 20th, we are having our end-of-year Hazak celebration. The year is coming to a close, and I invite everybody to sign up and attend. You can either sign up on paper, or you can mail it in, or online, vbs.org/Hazak. It's $20 per person. We'll have good food, good people, good entertainment. We've got Cantor Jackie Raffi and Cantor Phil Barron presenting Jewish songs from around the world. Will be our musical program for that day. So sign up. You got until May 13th to sign up for May 20th. We've got to tell catering how many people we're going to have so they can prepare for the meal. And then just a couple of last announcements. We have our Hazak Sisterhood Game Day. The next one is on May 13th. If you're interested in playing games, Mahjong seems to be the predominant one, but there's others, Rummy Tile, etc. Please come, sign up online for May 13th, 10 a.m. That's a Monday. And the next Hazak Sunday walk will be on May 19th, the day before the end-of-year celebration, with Cantor Phil Barron, who's going to be doing another mindfulness walk around Lake Balboa. And for those of you who attended the one just a couple weeks ago, it was very fun, very enjoyable, and I encourage you to sign up. And other than that, stay tuned for any summer programming that we're going to be talking about doing. So with that, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our senior rabbi, Rabbi Nolan Lebovitz. Rabbi Lebovitz was born in Chicago, raised in Chicago, but came to LA to attend USC Film School. Seems to be a theme for today. And spent 10 years as a filmmaker before enrolling in the Ziegler Rabbinical School of American Jewish University. And for 7 years, he served as the rabbi at Adat Shalom in West Los Angeles before we lured him to VBS. He's a national board member of Merkaz. He's a member of the Masorti Rabbinic Cabinet and a delegate to the World Zionist Conference in Jerusalem. He volunteers as the rabbi in residence for Cafe Europa, a Los Angeles community of Shoah survivors. And more recently, he was awarded his PhD in religion at Claremont Graduate University with a focus on the Hebrew Bible. and is a recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship. And of course, I think his PhD sort of relates to his topic today, back to the world of the Bible. Rabbi, welcome back.
Good morning, everybody. I want to acknowledge that it was a difficult weekend, and many of us sat Shabbos afternoon glued to our televisions, and I made the announcement here during a program about all of the drones and missiles that were being shot at Israel, and thank God there weren't so many deaths. There were actually no deaths as a result. There was one girl, a 7-year-old girl of Bedouin descent, who was injured, and we pray as a community for her well-being, that she be healed by the Israeli doctors who are attending to her. I wanted to take you back to a different world that not many Jews know about. And so let's begin in a way by talking about the world of the Bible in general. So many of us received the Hebrew Bible. Actually, not many of us received the Hebrew Bible. Let's start out that way. Many of us see the Chumash in Shul. Nod your heads if you know what I'm talking about. Yes? Okay. You know the red book that sits in front of you in synagogue. And that book has the 5 books of Moses, and it has excerpts from other books that we read as Haftorahs. Everybody follows so far? We're familiar with this. Those Haftorahs are excerpts from lots of other books in the Hebrew Bible. Mostly we like to highlight Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. This past week we read from the 2nd book of Kings, which was a nice change of pace, but not many of us pay that much attention because Haftorah translates into English as bathroom break. So we end up, thank you, there's going to be a lot of subtle humor. Thank you, Helen, for laughing. Not so subtle. Great. Thank you, Pearl. So we end up not paying attention to the parts of the Bible that I think are crucial for us understanding who we are as a people. When I meet with evangelical counterparts and when I go speak in churches, they come to church with an entire Bible highlighted, notes, paper clipped to their favorite parts. They can, off the top of their head, recite chapter and verse from lots of the books towards the end of what we call the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. So we start from a place of, we start not fully familiar with all the books in the Tanakh to begin with, because we read the 5 books of Moses over and over again, and we don't spend a lot of time thinking and talking and learning about the books that come after Deuteronomy. Now I'm going to take you beyond that for a minute and talk about what it is that I studied when I was at Bar Ilan University, and that is we receive the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and it's bound, meaning to say there's a cover on it that insinuates in some way that it's closed, which is right. It is closed at this point, right? Somebody came along at some point and said, these are the books that are going to form the Tanakh, and all the other books are not part of the Tanakh. We all understand that as postmodern rational people, correct? I'm not saying anything too controversial yet. So just like when you receive, or when you used to receive in the olden days, a newspaper, somebody decided what was in that newspaper and what was not going to be in that newspaper. And when you received the newspaper, it very much reflected the thought process and the vision of the editor-in-chief of the newspaper. So we call that editor-in-chief of the Tanakh the redactor, the person who decided what was in and what was out. And there's a lot of academics who spend time trying to dream up who that person was or who that committee was. It's Jewish, so we think it must have been a committee. There must have been food at the committee meetings, that kind of thing. And we like to think about why it is that we decided those things. So when I was at Bar Ilan, part of what I was doing there for that period of time was not only to look at the Tanakh and study the Tanakh. I could study the Tanakh here in Los Angeles. I could study the Tanakh in New York. There are Bible scholars at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all over the place, and Claremont, where I was. There are Bible scholars everywhere that can help you study the Tanakh. What I wanted to do was to study the books that didn't make it into the Tanakh. So I wanted to study the New York Times bestseller list from the 2nd century before the Common Era. Is everybody with me so far? Yeah? Because this is a topic we don't normally speak about, right? We assume that the books in the Tanakh were intended to be included in the Tanakh, and everything else was not included to be in the Tanakh, and I highly doubt that's what happened. I highly doubt that the committee met at the beginning and said, this is the mission statement of the committee to create the Tanakh. We know where we're going, and at the very end, they did it perfectly. And the reason I know that is because I've worked with plenty of Jewish boards of directors and committees to know that committees don't work perfectly like that. Jews don't work perfectly like that. There's lots of outside influences that come in and get involved and muddle the process as you go through. What starts out as the mission of the committee doesn't always end up as the mission of the committee. There are extraordinarily meaningful and popular pieces of literature, literary works, that emanate from our people in the 2nd century before the Common Era, which was a pivotal moment for us. What happens in the 2nd century of the Common Era? At the beginning of 200 BCE, the Assyrian Greeks defeat the Ptolemaic Greeks in essentially a post-Alexander civil war that ends up transferring control of the land of Israel from the Ptolemaic Greeks in Egypt to the Assyrian Greeks in Assyria. This, of course, is something I don't need to remind you about. You know all the details. But just just for the sake of time, the Ptolemaic Greeks we were okay with in Egypt. They were tolerant of Jewish culture and they loved Judaism. I wouldn't go that far. They liked Jewish culture and they were tolerant of Jews living in Israel. And when the Assyrian Greeks take over in the year 200, they feel more challenged by Jewish life in general and don't understand why we haven't just become completely Hellenized ourselves. To the point where in 178 BCE, Antiochus IV, a new Assyrian king, takes over and says for the first time, it's not that I don't want Jews to be Jewish, I just don't want Jews to be circumcised or keep kosher or keep Shabbos or come together as communities anymore. That's all. And the temple is going to become a gymnasium. So outside of that, you can do whatever you'd like. And also, by the way, the taxes that are going to go to the temple, it's actually not going to go to the temple anymore. It's going to come to our temple here in Assyria. And that set of laws that he passed, they ultimately prompt a revolution that begins with a small family that runs out into the hills. That revolt we commemorate today with the holiday of Hanukkah. Very good. Okay. So the war between the Maccabees and the Assyrian Greeks takes place in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And for the first time in more than 750 years, an autonomous Jewish kingdom is created in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Right? So 164 BCE is equivalent in some ways to 1948. That's how momentous a moment it is in 164 BCE. And it doesn't last for very long, right? It lasts for those years. But if you could just imagine, we end up moving from, Judah Maccabee to Simon to somebody to somebody to somebody, where we end up with Jasons and all kinds of Hellenized names being the leaders of the Jewish people. It only takes a matter of a few generations for this to happen. So meaning we fight and die to create something separate, and then not shortly thereafter, the rulers themselves decide to become Hellenized, and the kingdom begins to crumble from within, all leading to 70 and the destruction of the temple. Okay? So this is a period of time that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, learning about, reading about. And just like last year, I don't have to review because everybody took such copious notes, but last year I came here and I spoke to you about Susanna, which is a single chapter book that bears a lot of resemblance to Esther, written around the same time, 2nd century BCE, in the sense that there's a female protagonist. She fights for justice. She has to move the community of the Jewish people. It is critical of the Jewish people in that way. It's different than Esther. meaning the antagonist is not Haman or some outsider. The antagonist in the book of Susanna is inside the Jewish community themselves, as two Jewish elders. But I tried to present it in a way that's a piece of what we call apocrypha. That's a piece of Jewish literature from the period of the Bible that was not included in the final redaction of the Hebrew Bible. Right? That's what apocrypha means. Apocrypha is a piece of biblical literature that didn't make it into the Bible. And in Jewish tradition, we have lots of this at every stage of literature. We have pieces of literature that don't actually make it into the final version. So Susanna, that I brought last year and was so well received by this group, is 1 chapter long, tells you an entire story, and then did not make it in, but it bears no mention in most of the Jewish tradition. I introduced you to a piece of Susanna. Today I'm going to bring you a piece of literature from the same period, okay, 2nd century BCE, that's called the writings of Ben Sira, or the wisdom of Ben Sira, the book of Ben Sira, or even the book of Jesus, son of Sira. All of these are names for the same piece of literature that I just handed out. And as opposed to one single chapter story, Ben Sira gives us more than 50 chapters of his wisdom literature. Ben Sira lives in the 2nd century before the Common Era, we believe. And we also believe that he is a member of the elite status in Jerusalem, meaning to say he's highly educated, he's a scribe, and he's trying to give wisdom to people who are landowners, maintain families, trying to educate their own children. He's looking at a way of life in Jerusalem among the haves, among the socioeconomic top class, and he's trying to tell them for Judaism to endure, for our way of life to endure, we have to behave in this following manner. And he's able to write it in his day in what was essentially iambic pentameter of his day. He doesn't only write, he writes it in poetic verse. And originally it's believed that he wrote in Hebrew, because we have found fragments in the Cairo Geniza, but the book popularizes in Greek, and as opposed to Susanna, that's never really mentioned by rabbis or following Jewish leaders of different times, Ben Sira is quoted in the Talmud. So the rabbis of the Talmud in the earliest generations are familiar with the wisdom of Ben Sira. And they talk about the wisdom of Ben Sira in the Talmud, which leads us to believe that if Ben Sira wasn't on the New York Times bestseller list, it was awfully close. Does everybody follow the analogy? Right? So, what does it mean to be an educated Jew in 2024? It means that we want to see not just what was handed to us, not just the book that ends up in the pew. I want to know what was all around that book. Right? So in an hour, you're going to see great moments in cinema, and there are going to be great scenes from movies, and I don't know which movies, Ari selected, but I'm sure they'll be phenomenal. But as somebody who attended film school, I just don't see the Jews on the screen or the non-Jews portraying Jews on the screen. The greatest moments in cinema are the Jews behind the camera that are shooting those scenes. Does everybody understand? Just like the greatest moments of the Bible and the Tanakh is not only the pages that are bound in the final version of the red book that's put in the slot in front of you, it's the entire world that's around those stories. And I have to think to myself, who wrote this story? For whom was it written? What were they trying to espouse in that moment? So why did I come to Ben Sira, and why did I come to the appreciation of Ben Sira? It's because in the middle of Ben Sira, actually towards the end of Ben Sira starts to do something that no other author does in his time. And he writes a poem in praise of the great Jewish men of history. Right? So we don't have that In the Torah, Moses doesn't stop and say, I'd like to stop and praise all the previous generations of leadership before me. Many times he mentions the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, which is no different than the way we begin our Shemona Esrei now, right? We begin the same way, the same type of prayer policy. Others, as we get further away from Moses in the Hebrew Bible, some of them refer to Moses, most of them don't. Ben Sira, as an educated Jew living in the 2nd century before the Common Era, steps forward and says, I'm going to make a timeline. Right? The next couple of people that we could call somewhat historians, right? We could call Philo a historian of sorts in 2nd century before the Common Era in Alexandria, or 1st century before the Common Era in Alexandria. We can definitely call Josephus Flavius one of the most important, significant early historians. Then we're talking the 1st century of the Common Era, right? He's trying to make the case to Rome that the Jewish people is an extraordinary people that should be spared, that should be celebrated, that our tradition is so significant. But here, just a few hundred years earlier than Josephus Flavius, Ben Sira comes along, and in the middle of his book of literature, of wisdom, of poetry, he says, I'm actually going to praise Jewish history. Why would it be important for me as a scholar of the book of Esther to come and look at this list and say, Ben Sira makes a list of the great Jews of history in the 2nd century before the Common Era? Why is it important for me to look at the list? I'm asking. Yeah. Some of my questions are rhetorical, but some are not. Yes. I'm asking. Why is it important for us to look on the list? Brian, yeah. That's exactly, maybe I should look at those people. And not only that, if he really is, as he's considered by the rabbis and by our tradition and by contemporaries around him, so educated, should I trust his list of Jewish history? Yeah, it reflects a purview of his time. It teaches me a lesson, because what happens if I'm, well, let's just cut to the chase of my dissertation. If I'm arguing that Mordecai and Esther are two people that never existed, right? If that's the argument, that Mordecai and Esther never existed, and Ben Sira doesn't mention them in his list of historical Jewish figures that should be praised, thank you, Joel. It reinforces my point. Thank you very much. Because everyone is data. If I'm saying that Esther is the greatest piece of Jewish literature ever written by an author who sat down and wrote a story that became extraordinarily popular, then part of the list that I look at in terms of saying, well, how would one begin to think whether Esther was a character that existed, if Esther was a real person or not a real person, right? The answer is, there has to be historical corroboration for that story. If the story, think about it, if the Jews had killed tens of thousands of people, wouldn't there be something in the world that says, anybody in the world who says that? Think about what's happening right now in the world. Right? The world is not, were the Jewish people to kill one person, the world would put it on front page newspaper. So there has to be something somewhere outside of the book of Esther. So when I began by saying, well, I want to read other things from the same time period that I think the book of Esther was written, it begins this question of looking and studying other pieces of literature that we know were popular, not only accepted by Jewish people, but Ben Sira makes it into the apocryphic works of Catholic Church, right? So the Catholics hold on to Ben Sira from the beginning, and the way that the Catholics and the Christians, the way that they choose what they want from the Hebrew Bible, I believe also influences the way that we chose what we wanted from the Hebrew Bible in the final stages of the writing of these pieces of literature, right? If they chose something, it meant that we probably wouldn't want it. And that is that's a tragedy, because that means that we give up, we yielded some of our tradition away, because the tear that was happening, the rift that was happening in the Jewish people was very scary for the Jewish people that were living through it at the time in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. So let's move to Ben Sira. Let's take a look at what it is that he has to say. Let's read his list of historical figures together. And let's take a look at what an illiterate, educated scribe living in the 2nd century of the Common Era in Jerusalem has to say about the history of Jewish leadership. Any questions before I begin? Yeah. It popularizes in Greek, but we have reason to believe that it was written in Hebrew originally. So fragments in the Cairo Geniza surfaced of the Hebrew, and they think that those are fragments of original Ben Sira writings in Hebrew. It's a great question. Yeah, Gary. It's a great question. So then, I won't do it justice. You won't hear Gary's voice. You'll hear my voice. But this is a list of great Jewish men. Esther's not a man. So could it be that he didn't include her because she's not a man? And the answer to that is yes, you're 1,000% right. Just like Josephus Flavius doesn't record a holiday of Purim, he records a day of celebrating Mordechai, the victor of Shushan. So the idea that I'm not just looking for things to support me, or I wasn't in Israel just looking for little details and saying, Esther's not mentioned, so that means that it didn't, had there been any mention of we look for what's here and what's not here, and it's clear that Josephus is aware of Purim and aware of the story in the 1st century of the Common Era, and here in the 2nd century before the Common Era, so we're 300 years earlier. That was what brought me to this list. When I say brought me, really smart people heard what I was writing about and said to me, have you ever read chapters 44 through 50 of Ben Sira? And I said, no. And that's why you go to learn at a place where people are much smarter than you. Okay. Hymn in honor of our ancestors. Let us now sing the praise of famous men, our ancestors in their generations. The Lord apportioned to them great glory. Does everybody see I'm reading in chapter 44? Yeah? Okay, great. There's a big 44 in the middle of the page. That's where I'm reading, okay? I'm now in the 2nd verse. The Lord apportioned to them great glory, his majesty from the beginning. There were those who ruled in their kingdoms and made a name for themselves by their valor, those who gave counsel because they were intelligent, those who spoke in prophetic oracles, those who led the people by their counsels and by their knowledge of the people's love. They were wise in their words of instruction. Those who composed musical tunes or put verses in writing, rich men endowed with resources living peacefully in their homes. All these were honored in their generations and were the pride of their times. Some of them left behind a name so that others declare their praise. But of others there is no memory. They have perished as though they had never existed. They have become as though they had never been born, they and their children after them. But these were also godly men, whose righteous deeds have not been forgotten. Their wealth will remain with their descendants, and their inheritance with their children's children. Their descendants stand by the covenants, their children also for their sake. Their offspring will continue forever, and their glory will never be blotted out. Their bodies are buried in peace, but their name lives on generation after generation. So I just want to give you a taste. This is no fool. Everybody understand what I'm saying? This is just like we read the Song of Songs, which is written approximately this time, I would argue. Just like we read, this is wisdom literature of the highest degree. This is someone writing in poetic verse, okay? And he begins a historical accounting, and I would argue that it's incredibly Jewish in nature, not Hellenistic, not late Greco, early Roman, not Greco-Roman when I say that, not early Christianic in the sense that it's not messianic at all. He's not saying that their names live on because they live at the top of a mountain and the gods have blessed them in some way, which Jewish authors were writing at this time. He's saying their names live on through their children, through their values, which coincidentally is very much the way that you'll hear Rabbi Feinstein and I speak about Judaism today. right? May their memory be for a blessing. Still is something that we say. Okay. The first person, if you were going to start with Jewish heroes, a Jewish timeline, the first person that you would start with is, I don't think you'd start with Enoch, but you read ahead. Thank you very much. But I doubt anybody in this room knows who Enoch was. But so the first person, let's just think to ourselves, how would you start the first great Jew? Abraham. Very good. That's where I would start too, okay? Just so everybody knows. We'll put the Enoch person in the corner and we would start with Abraham. We'd start with Abraham and Sarah as the first Jews. He doesn't. This reflects that there was a different thought process at the time. To this day, whenever I meet with black pastors or different sects of Christianity, they will ask me if we read Enoch here in our congregation. Because in their congregations, they read Enoch as a story of Israel and Jewish people. And the answer is no. Most of our folks don't even know the name Enoch. So he starts with Enoch. Enoch pleased the Lord and was taken up, an example of repentance to all generations. Who is Enoch? Enoch is the father of Methuselah. In the book of Genesis, I forget which, this is before Genesis 11, this is way before Abraham, before Noah, in one of the generational things, and one of the, begot lists. There's 10 generations that divide Adam to Noah. There's another 10 generations that divide Noah to Abraham. So the number 10 is significant in the Jewish tradition. It means a complete cycle, a complete anything. 10 Commandments is a complete teaching. And Methuselah is somebody who lived a super long time. Enoch lives for a long time. And it doesn't say that Enoch died and he begot so-and-so. It says that God took Enoch, Chanoch in Hebrew. God took Chanoch because he was so faithful. All right? So that's where the story begins. The story begins with Chanoch. Was there a question here? Was there a question? No? Okay, great. Let's turn the page. Noah was found perfect and righteous. In the time of wrath, he kept the race alive. Therefore, a remnant was left on earth when the flood came. Everlasting covenants were made with him, that all flesh should never again be blotted out by a flood. So Noah gets a shout out. That's great. Abraham was the great father of a multitude of nations, and no one has been found like him in glory. This is a fascinating verse. The next one. He kept the law of the Most High. God bless you. The law is literally translated as the Torah. Right? In the Hebrew, it says he kept the Torah of the Most High. So, makes us wonder, right? How does Ben Sira understand, this is the timeline, Abraham comes before Moses and Mount Sinai. So how does he understand Abraham's life? Or does he think that there's an idea larger than Torah, larger than the Torah, that's Torah? Does everybody understand what I just said? Right? And I would argue that the Jewish tradition does believe that there's an idea larger than the Torah, that's Torah. Right? That's why the beginning of Pirkei Avot reads Torah, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. Moses received Torah at Sinai, and he transmitted it to Joshua, transmitted it to the elders, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't say Moshe Kibel HaTorah Misinai. It doesn't say Moses received the Torah from Sinai. It says Moses received Torah from Sinai. Those are two very different ideas. And the rabbis from the very beginning are explaining to us there's an idea bigger than the scroll that we take out on Shabbos. There's a law bigger than that. There's a driving force that God wants from us. And the most physical manifestation of that is the scroll that we take out and kiss. But the scroll that we take out and kiss is the greatest symbol that we have of that divine sanctity in our life, but it is not the totality of the divine sanctity. Okay, there's the Torah, it represents something larger, which is Torah. We're getting into some kind of profound philosophical conversation I didn't know that we were going to have, but thank you for that. Therefore, the Lord assured him with an oath that the nations would be blessed through his offspring, that he would make him as numerous as the dust of the earth and exalt his offspring like the stars. Give them the inheritance from sea to sea, from the Euphrates to the ends of the earth, right? So the ends of the earth, let's just say, is the Mediterranean. The Euphrates is in Babylonia. This is almost the entirety of the civilized world in that time, okay? To Isaac, also he gave the same assurance for the sake of his father Abraham, the blessing of all people in the covenant. He made to rest on the head of Jacob. He acknowledged him the blessings and gave him the inheritance. He divided his portions and distributed them among the 12 tribes. I think I missed he certified the covenant in his flesh. So there's a bris, right? So he acknowledges the Brit Milah. So far, this is right on target in terms of the book of Genesis, right? If you go to 45, Moses, whose memory is blessed. Oh, from his descendants, the Lord brought forth a godly man. Okay, that was Moses. He made him equal in glory to the holy ones, made him great to the terror of his enemies. By the words he performed miracles, the Lord glorified him in the presence of kings. He gave him commandments for his people, revealed to him his glory. For his faithfulness and meekness, he consecrated him, choosing him out of all humankind. He allowed him to hear his voice, led him into the dark cloud, gave him the commandments face to face, the law of life and knowledge, so that he might teach Jacob the covenant and Israel his decrees. Right? That's Moses. Moses gets a great paragraph. All right. He exalted Aaron, a holy man like Moses, who is brother of the tribe of Levi. So I just want to keep going. He talks about the ephod. He talks about the different symbols of Aaron. Yes?
Faithfulness and meekness.
Sure.
The notion of meekness surprises me. Is being faithful the same as being meek?
No, I think in this case, or the way that I read it at least, it's a great question. The way that I read it is that meekness is his expression of the concept of humility, right? Which is what the Torah tells us. Moses was a man of anavah, of great humility. Okay, he's the only one that's written like that. So he talks about the tribes of Israel. From this point, he talks about, if you skip ahead to the middle of the next column, he talks about Datan and Aviram and Korach. To this point, Ben Sira sounds like somebody who has read the Torah, right? He's totally aware of the Torah. He's read it, he's internalized it, and he's made it into a poem. He's crafted it into a poem. This is the story of the 5 books of Moses. And then we move forward. He says, I didn't just read the Torah, I read other stuff too, all right? Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, is in the Torah. I'm skipping down. Now I'm skipping to verse 25. Verse 25. So there's a big 46 on the number, big 46 on the page, and I'm just a few sentences above the big 46. How much more time do I have, Joe? Like 3 more hours?
No, you got 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So we get to, just as a covenant was established with David, son of Jesse, of the tribe of Judah, that the king's heritage passes only from son to son, so the heritage of Aaron. That sentence sounds strange to me. Why does the sentence sound strange? Who comes first?
Didn't Aaron come first?
Aaron comes first. The sentence should read, just like God created a descendants from Aaron, son to son, so too David, son to son. But we already see the beginning of a tipping point that's reflected in a lot of literature of this era, right? Who do the people living in Israel feel close to? Who do they call upon in terms of a tradition to come save them, to be strong and to lead them again? David. We still do it today. If you walk down to the ECC, you'll hear the kids sing a silly song that goes, David Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam, right? David, the king of Israel, be established, come back and reestablish yourself. This is a notion where we have to really think, right? Just like Moses is the hero of the 5 books, I would argue that if you look at the totality of the Bible, King David is certainly, if not greater than Moses, certainly a hero, a major, major historical figure that the Jewish people bases much of its identity on his life and accomplishment. After David, we come back to Joshua, son of Nun. So David gets inserted kind of out of order. We'll come back to David again, believe me. Joshua, son of Nun, now we're in the 6th book of the Tanakh, we're at the book of Joshua, was the successor of Moses in the prophetic office. Okay, let's skip ahead. He had a buddy named Caleb that's also remembered. Okay, we move from the book of Joshua through the Judges. I'm on the very beginning of the book, of the page where it says 47 in big numbers. The judges also, with their respective names, were in the book of Judges. The next paragraph, Samuel was beloved by his Lord, a prophet of the Lord. He established the kingdom and anointed rulers over his people. So now we've moved from Deuteronomy to Joshua to Judges to Samuel. I'm looking for the first mention of David as I skim through. 47. After him, Nathan rose up to prophecy in the days of David. It's fascinating. There is no beginning to the idea of David. The idea of the beginning of David and his work about great Jewish leaders begins long before with Aaron. And there is no great introduction that the child shepherd of David rises up to defeat Goliath, which is what we would assume in some historical retelling if somebody is basing it on the works of the Tanakh. Okay? Then it comes down later. In his youth did he not kill a giant and take away the people's disgrace when he whirled the stone in the sling and struck down the boasting Goliath? David's introduction, David spans a lot of this as like he overshadows all of Jewish history in terms of if you're going to recite a poem of great Jewish leaders, King David overlays a shadow over all of them, which I think in some ways is poetic when we talk about it. Okay, let's skip ahead. Okay, after David, it's a long section on David. We get to Solomon. If we're looking at page 48, right in front of him, Solomon rested with his ancestors and left behind him one of his sons, broad in folly and lacking in sense. Right? We're saying that he left behind a son not so worthy, not so great. Rehoboam, whose policy drove the people to revolt, or I'd say split the kingdom into two. Right? So that's what split Judah and Israel. Ben Sira is writing in a time where how many kingdoms exist? One. What's the kingdom that's left? What is it called? Judah, that's right. That's exactly right. So he is already lamenting the idea that the northern kingdom was destroyed centuries earlier and there's no chance, there's no relic of that people left anymore. Right? Those 10 tribes are gone, and he is showing us that he understands the story of how it came about. Then in 48, we have Elijah. If you're looking at the big number 48, Elijah, he takes a golden Uber. We have his student Elisha, who comes onto the scene. Hezekiah fortifies the city of Jerusalem. Today you can go to Jerusalem and walk through Hezekiah's tunnels if you're not claustrophobic and you're not afraid of sinking in water. You can go into Hezekiah's tunnels. And then we move forward from one generation to the next. 49, Josiah. You're looking at the big number 49. Ezekiel's vision. Nehemiah brought us back. I'm reading above chapter 50. He comes back to the beginning. Few have ever been created on earth like Enoch, for he was taken up from the earth, nor was anyone ever born like Joseph. Even his bones were cared for. Shem, Seth, Enosh were honored, but above every other created living being was Adam. In some ways, this concludes biblical history. And now we're going to jump to present tense. The leader of his brothers and the pride of his people was the high priest Simon, son of Onias. Okay? So if you look down on the notes, look down in the very little script where it says 50.1 to 24, the high priest Simon II, son of Onias, was in office from 219 to 196 BCE, perhaps during Ben Sira's own lifetime. The high priest combined what we would call civic and religious functions. Ben Sira praises him first for his building activities, okay, because everybody loves a new dedicated sanctuary, right? And then he also praises him for like the lunar calendar and all of these ideas. As we go through this list, and you'll look through, he calls back to Aaron. I want you to turn now to the next page. We're going to end on chapter 50, okay? So we're on the very back of the final packet. Everybody should be looking at a page that says 51. The sons of Aaron shouted, they blew their trumpets of hammered metal, they sounded a mighty fanfare as a reminder before the Most High. Does everybody see where I am? No. I'm on the very last page. There's a big number 51 in the middle of the page. Okay. Okay. I was at 16. And now I'm going to skip down towards the bottom to 22. And now bless the God of all, who everywhere works great wonders, who fosters our growth from birth and deals with us according to his mercy. May he give us gladness of heart. May there be peace in our days in Israel as in the days of old. May he entrust to us his mercy. May he deliver to us in our own days. Two nations my soul detests, which is, someone can't write a Jewish poem about people we love without saying, actually, we hate some people also. So we want to write this in too. Two nations my soul detests. And the third is not even a people. Those who live in Seir and the Philistines and the foolish people that live in Shechem. Shechem is a modern-day city, of course, in Israel that's known as Nazareth, but that's not what he's talking about. Shechem is the city in the book of Genesis that Shimon and Levi destroy as a result of the rape of Dinah, right? So just to bring you back to another story from Genesis. Instruction, and it's an ancient city, meaning there have always been people that live in Shechem, just like there have always been people who live in Jerusalem. There have always been people who live in Jericho. This is one of the ancient cities that have existed from the beginning. Instruction and understanding and knowledge. I've written in this book his own name, Jesus, son of Eleazar, son of Sirach of Jerusalem, whose mind poured forth wisdom. Happy are those who concern themselves with these things. Those who lay them to heart will become wise. For if they put them into practice, they'll be equal to anything. For the fear of the Lord is their path. So, why do people date this book to the 2nd century before the Maccabean revolt? Why would a scholar reading this list say this happened before the Maccabees? Because he mentions the high priest Simon of Onias that lived before the Maccabees, and he stops. That's the last figure that he concludes with, before he praises himself, of course, which is a phenomenal thing for everybody to do. Does everybody understand the thought process of why scholars would say, well, he reached this point in history, so it means he lived during that time, or he lived immediately following that time. But had he lived during the time of Judah Maccabee, during the Maccabees, what is the assumption? He would have included them in the list. Because who else included him in the list? Who acknowledged the might of Judah Maccabee? Josephus, Jewish writers, Assyrian Greek writers, early Roman writers, right? Judah Maccabee is acknowledged as a force, not by only the people living in Modi'in, but by global superpowers worldwide. They understand what happened to the Assyrian Greeks, and they write about it. And they write about it as a lesson that they should learn, right? That if you upset native culture to such an extent, they will rise up in the forests. They'll fight you in any way that they can. They'll push you back. Beware. Beware to other colonial forces around the world, that there is a people that have been pushed so far that they rise up in this kind of revolt. So Judah Maccabee is assumed, or his brother Simon or his brother Joshua would have been included in the list in some way. So they say, well, it must have happened before that revolt, right? The revolt of 167 to 164. So if Simon Onias is known between the year 220 to 194 BCE, and Judah Maccabee the revolt does not begin until 167 BCE, somewhere in that 30-year period, Ben Sira must be writing. Everybody follow the logic? Yeah? Okay. This is the way that historians begin to try to date pieces of literature like this, all right? And we have to think to ourselves, right, from the time of Nehemiah, who gets mentioned in the poem, to Simon of Onias, there isn't one Jewish hero mentioned. That's also reflective of perhaps his different understanding than our understanding. Right? Who do we put in that category? We put Ezra, right? Ezra and Nehemiah is a duo. Then we have Mordecai and Esther. Then we have Daniel. Right? There is a lot of Jewish narrative that occurs between that point and Ben Sira. And so the question is, what do we do with it? Right? What do we do with the Jewish narrative, and what do we do with this? So whoever the redactor is, he decided what to do with this. What did he do with it? He put it in a drawer. Right? Everybody understand? He put it in a drawer. He took this, he rolled it up, and he said, this is where this belongs, and he puts it he closes the cabinet, and the Jewish people doesn't learn it. But something funny happens, and that's if you're a literate Jew and you read the Talmud, you see that there are references to this person, Ben Sira, who is wise and educated, who tries to make sure that Jewish families educate their children and keep them in this tradition. And you begin to ask, who's Ben Sira and where's the book? Now, there are lots of books that we lose because they're just lost in history. They're lost in history. There are books referenced in the Hebrew Bible that we don't have anymore. There are books referenced in other books, right? In the book of Esther, King Ahasuerus wakes up and he wants to hear the chronicles of the kings of Persia. We don't know what that is, but in that book they read him about Mordecai saved his life, right? And then he says, how should we honor such a person, right? So there are books that are just lost, or there are books that we don't know what happened to them, or perhaps didn't exist in the first place. But this book was not lost. This book was picked up by other peoples and said, this is wisdom. This guy who received the, whatever you imagine, Ivy League, whatever is the kosher word for Ivy League now, whatever that is, the top tier education of his time, that's what he received. And he was walking around Jerusalem in the 2nd century before the Common Era, praying for peace in Jerusalem, and he was trying to teach others a wisdom tradition about Judaism, how we should understand Judaism. And the rabbis, the early rabbis, certainly did not think this was treif. They did not think this was treif. The Catholics, or the earliest church, didn't think this was treif. But somehow it doesn't make it into the Tanakh. It doesn't make it into the Tanakh. I would argue that in the event that it loses its sanctity because it's not in the Tanakh, it doesn't lose its value. There is what to be learned from Ben Sira. And the idea that he sat down and wrote this, and perhaps it wasn't as popular as Esther. And I can prove it to you, because there's no holiday of Ben Sira where you wear funny masks. It wasn't as popular as Esther. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't read it and know it and connect with him. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? And so, now I'm lucky enough to call a lot of these people colleagues or friends, but when you have these books being published called the Jewish Annotated Apocrypha, it shows that there's a movement afoot by Jews today to better understand the world of Second Temple Jerusalem. And the way that we're going to get there is not just through the traditional sources, but it's also through the sources that were pushed aside. To understand better what happened. Because without understanding better what happened and what people understood in 2nd century BCE, especially those with wealth and privilege and education, we won't understand how to face the challenges that seem to recur in our people's history again and again. Before I say thank you, I'll answer a couple of questions, and then I think I going to be pushed off for movies. Yes.
I just want to clean up my question of a half an hour ago.
Sure.
And that is, if you were Ben Sira, would you have included Mordechai?
Okay, so if I was Ben Sira, had I known about Mordechai, is the question. So in my dissertation, I would argue there's no way for him to have known about Mordechai because Esther was a story that was constructed to teach the people a lesson, right? It's a Greek play told in Hebrew, a perfectly designed 10-chapter theatrical production, which doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. And the reason it was done, it was written by somebody like the Aaron Sorkin of Second Temple Times, who sat down and said, we need a story that will teach people that when you live in diaspora, you live at the whim of crazy people. For sure, certainly, for sure. Yeah, Jerry.
These aren't questions, but just two comments that I can't not make.
Sure.
The first is you talk about the absence of mentioning the Hasmoneans, the Hanukkah
Right.
wonders and so forth. That's interesting, but that is also didn't make the cut.
Right.
That is also Apocrypha. That's just an observation.
That's right.
More significant is where we're sitting right now, because we're sitting in a conservative synagogue. The father of conservative Judaism was Solomon Schechter.
That's right.
But what he did relates to this book.
Of course, because the Cairo Geniza.
Because the Cairo Geniza was unknown territory, except in strange ways, and he was teaching at Cambridge, and he had a run-in, that is a meeting, a chance meeting, with the two crazy sisters who were interested, very educated and interested in this matter, and they had bought from some funny dealer a page that they couldn't read.
That's right.
So I don't think it was Hebrew.
It could have been Hebrew, it could have been Aramaic, could have been any number of things. We're not sure.
It was like a proto-Hebrew.
That's right. That's right.
And they couldn't read it. And he said, well, I'll look at it. And
Right.
he did, and he recognized it as Ben Sira. And that got him to Cairo, and that got the Geniza opened, and that got the Geniza books brought back.
Right.
And so the book itself should be on the list of heroes.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great point.
Rabbi Lebovitz?
I think Brian had a
Okay,
question before, and then I'll say goodbye. I
you have
promise.
a quickie?
Okay. I'll see you in a couple hours. I won't say goodbye for very long. Yeah.
So thanks for a great presentation. With your background and your education, you studied the Tanakh, you studied a lot of these books that didn't make it. What's your opinion about why some did and some didn't?
Okay, so that's like a 501 question, Brian. This is a 101 class, but I'll very briefly explain to you that I think books made it and didn't make it for all sorts of different reasons. The books that come at the end are the most varied and the most highly developed, which makes sense, right? So if we read the book of Genesis together, it's kind of clunky. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but the editing of it is kind of clunky. Samuel is one of my professors called a hot mess, right? So we look at sentences that come after sentences that refute one another or don't agree with one another, whatever it might be. By the time you get to Esther and Ben Sira and Ruth and Daniel, these are much more highly sophisticated pieces of writing. And the reason is because we have interacted with the great Greek dramas of the 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, right? Hellenism coming to town. This is a perfect segue between me and the next presentation, right? Jews like to be in the entertainment business. We always have. We always will. And the idea that we were great storytellers, and then we met other people that were great storytellers, and we looked at what they were doing, and they were not writing in scrolls. They were putting it up in these semicircle theaters we thought to ourselves, wow, we could write stories that more resemble their structures. What makes them so sophisticated? What makes them feel like this? Let's adopt a kind of style now. And so we end up with books at the end of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, like Esther and Ruth, that are highly developed novellas with a beginning, middle, and end, each one. What leads us to what's accepted and what's not accepted, I think, has a lot to do with the factors like popularity, factors that feel like it fits or like it doesn't fit, like whether or not it was written in Hebrew or written in Greek. The book of Maccabees was written originally in Greek, and I think that scares a lot of people from the outset to say, that's not part of our tradition. Whereas the book of Daniel, half of the book is written in Aramaic, that's part of our tradition. So there were lines that were felt by the people of their time that thought, this should be part of it, this feels like something completely different. And I think that there are multiple rubrics. And we don't know who ultimately closes the Hebrew Bible. But we know that by the time that Josephus looks at the Hebrew Bible, it's a book. And we know by the earliest generation of church leaders, when they refer back to the Hebrew Bible, it's a book. It's done. So sometime between this moment of the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 1st century and 2nd century of the Common Era, it's certainly been redacted and published. And part of that has to do with when we interact with Greece in the 3rd and 2nd century of the Common Era, the Greeks say, all of our most important works are finished. They're published, quote unquote published, in a library, which is what they used to do. So they used to take their scrolls and put them in a public place so that educated people could come and read them at their leisure. That was being called published. They take the scroll and they deposit it in the library. Our first interaction with such a library is in Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And if I had to bet, and I'm not a betting person, but I might bet on this one, I'd bet that there were Jews that walked into that library of Alexandria because we were also educated. And we thought to ourselves, we should have books in here. We should have scrolls deposited in a public place. Why don't we have scrolls deposited in a public place? If that's the way that world culture acknowledges important books, we should also. And then that began a conversation, well, then what version? How many scrolls? What stories? What would define the Jewish canon of biblical literature? I would say that being pressed by the outside world, by an outside culture like the Greek one that we had so much admiration for and so much interaction with, would have probably forced us to reconsider how we looked at our own important stories. And in all honesty, I think it's a great thing that it did because it forced us to create the biblical canon that we've been blessed to enjoy.
And that'll be the sequel.
The sequel, that's exactly right. Next year, I'll come back for another one of these.
Thank you. Fascinating topic. Thank you so much.